Dorothy Florence Thorne, a 33-year-old housewife, was up bright and early on Tuesday, the 5th of July, 1932. Her husband of 10 years, Reginald Cecil Thorne, was still in bed, as he had been to a big boxing match at Rushcutters Bay the previous evening, when the American boxer, young Stribling, beat the Australian champion, Ambrose Palmer, when the referee stopped the fight in the 10th round. Usually it was their lodger, Alfred George Lockyer, who was the earliest to waken. Alfred was a commercial artist, but due to the downturn in the economy in the Great Depression, he had resorted to being a jobbing gardener to make ends meet. Lockyer had known both of the Thornes for 5 years. He had asked Reg Thorne if he needed any gardening done in February 1932. Both men were English and got on well, so that Thorne invited the other man to move into the bungalow at 25 Brierley Street, Mossman. There the three of them got on well. The Thornes had one child at the time, a daughter named Joan, who was aged 2.5. Their son Peter had died young in 1928. The couple was said to be devoted to each other, and both adored their little girl. There had been a maid who was employed to help with the housework, but by July 1932 the domestic work was done by Dorothy, with help from Reg and Lockyer. Dorothy was born in 1899 to William and Florence Cropley. Her grandfather John had started a boot shop in Sydney around about 1850, which had been so successful that from those humble origins, Cropley Limited and Cropley Knitting Mills had become the family business. Her father was nicknamed the Shoe King. It had meant that Dorothy had grown up well-to-do and was a wealthy woman. She owned a restaurant and a property in Brierley Street, as well as many shares in Cropley's and other enterprises. In October 1925, she made a will leaving all her property to her husband. Reg Thorne was born in England in the late 1880s. He claimed his father had been an army officer in India, but this does not conform with known family history. He had arrived in Australia in 1911 and had quickly established an engineering business at 368 Military Road, Mossman, which prospered. By 1919 he had a partner, George Burrows. This partnership lasted until October 1925, when Burrows died at hospital, aged 38. Reg received a patent in 1928 for an improved liquid measuring and dispensing apparatus. Dorothy and Reg married in 1922. She socialised a little, usually with her husband, although she had gone to the pictures a few times with Lockyer. She was extremely fond of her home, enjoying spending time with her husband and baby. She was bright, cheerful and popular. She had not an enemy in the world. Dorothy had been suffering from headaches for a while and took Sedlett's powders for relief. At about 6:30 she mixed a draught and drank it. Almost at once she felt something wasn't right. Sedlett's powders was a generic name for a common medication for upset digestion. They consisted of 2 packets, a white one containing tartaric acid and a blue packet which held potassium sodium tartrate and sodium bicarbonate. The powders from each packet were stirred in separate glasses until dissolved, and then combined into a fizzing mixture releasing carbon dioxide. The drink created was intended to combine with gastric juice to relieve internal gas. On June the 17th, Dorothy had purchased a tin of a dozen powders. She had already taken 4 of these without any problems. When Dorothy mixed her powder this morning, however, she noted that there was little fizz, but drained the glass nevertheless. To her dismay, it had a bitter taste. Within 15 minutes of taking the powders, she began to feel excruciating pain. Dorothy cried out from the kitchen, "I'm losing the use of my limbs." Only half an hour had elapsed since she had drunk the mixture. Reg leapt out of bed and hurried to attend to his wife. Finding her convulsing, he carried her to her room and telephoned the family physician, Dr. Paulette. The doctor, who had known Dorothy for 20 years, hastened over and was met by Reg in the hall. The 2 men were joined by Lockyer. Later, Dr. Paulette said he noticed nothing suspicious in the behaviour of either man. Examining Dorothy, the doctor realised that she was gravely ill. She had severe back pain and muscle spasms. Dorothy herself murmured that she felt terribly sick. Immediately she was borne out to the doctor's car, and he set off for a nearby hospital. Dorothy Thorne died in the doctor's car en route to hospital. The car, which had only travelled a quarter of a mile, returned to the Thorne residence, and later the body was taken away to the morgue. The police were notified that a death had occurred and that poisoning was suspected. Soon a team of 6 detectives were assigned to the case. The blue and white wrappers from the Sedlitz powder were still on the kitchen table where Dorothy had left them. The police checked them with interest. The white paper was carefully checked, but no trace of anything toxic was found on it. Then the blue paper was examined, and poison crystals were found adhering to it. Similar crystals were also located in the glass she had drunk from that morning. Due to the agonising death Dorothy had suffered, the poison was already believed to be strychnine. The analyst's report released the next week only confirmed what the investigation in the interim uncovered. The cause of death was ingestion of strychnine. The unfortunate woman had twice a lethal dose in her body. There were 7 unopened powders remaining in the tin, and a careful check revealed that none of them had been contaminated. Police were informed that no strychnine was kept in the house, ruling out accidental contamination after purchase. Police searches of the home revealed that this was true. The powders were locally manufactured in Sydney, and police visited the factory and checked if they could have been tainted prior to being wrapped. That too was ruled out. Not only were there procedures in place to guarantee the safety of the product, there was no strychnine anywhere in the factory. Nor was there any suggestion that the powders were interfered with at the chemist shop. The chemist, Mr. Mayhew, stated that he had sold dozens of tins of the powder from the same consignment, and nobody had complained about them. With the source of the poison a mystery, police began the exacting task of visiting all chemists in the suburbs of Cremorne and Mossman to check on sales of strychnine. Police were convinced of 2 things. Dorothy Thorne had not committed suicide, and that somebody had deliberately contaminated the powder. Assuming the intended victim was Mrs. Thorne, what was the motive? Reg never used the powders, while Lockyer occasionally took them. The suicide theory was rejected, as there seemed to be no reason for her to wish to end her life. She was happily married, friends and neighbours agreeing that the couple never quarrelled, adored her baby daughter, and was comfortably off financially. Dorothy had planned to spend the day she died with friends. It was speculated that possibly an intruder had entered the house and poisoned the powder for some reason. This was considered improbable, as the Thornes kept a dog, an Irish terrier, which always challenged strangers in his domain. The funeral took place on the afternoon of the 6th of July at Bruce's funeral parlour, Crow's Nest. When it came time for the coffin to be conveyed to the northern suburbs cemetery for burial, Reg and William Copley could not at first bring themselves to stand. The 2 men sat grief-stricken, with their heads on each other's shoulders. Dorothy's brother Eric was also visibly affected by the death of his only sister. 100 cars formed the procession to the cemetery. Among the mourners were employees of Burroughs and Thorne and Cropley's Limited, which closed all 4 city stores for the day. A detective attended the funeral, closely watching one of the mourners. Who this was not stated, although police already had a suspect in mind. Their suspect, apparently, was Alfred Lockyer. He was taken to the Criminal Investigation Bureau twice for intensive questioning. The first time police called on him was the Tuesday following the death, at 7:15 a.m, and detained him until 10:15 p.m. that night, with only a break for lunch. He claims he was bullied and cajoled to make a confession while there. The second time he was taken to CIB at 8 p.m, Lockyer later claimed that it had been suggested to him that he ought to commit suicide, but leave behind a note exonerating Reg Thorne. He claims one of the detectives said, "I understand you're an Englishman. It's up to you to take the Englishman's way out, but first sign a statement that you did it. We intend to put you down below, but we are giving you this chance." Although greatly stressed by this, instead, Lockyer wrote an account of his interactions with police and forwarded it to Smith's Weekly, a Sydney newspaper, who publicised Lockyer's version of events. They published his account of what had occurred at 25 Brierley Street on the fateful day. When he was working, it was Lockyer's habit to rise at about 6:30 a.m. and rouse Dorothy from her slumber. The Thornes slept in separate bedrooms, with her daughter sleeping beside Dorothy in a double bed. The Thornes had an agreement that due to the difficulties she had undergone giving birth to her second child, that the couple would have no more children. Lockyer would take a cup of tea to Dorothy, and often would take Reg his breakfast at 7 a.m. He asserted that they were so happy with their living arrangement that they were like 3 happy school kids. On the 5th of July, Dorothy entered Lockyer's bedroom and exclaimed, "I've beaten you to it this morning." He glanced at his alarm clock. It was 6:40 a.m. She left, but returned within a few minutes with a glass containing the residue of a Sedlitz powder, which she said tasted bitter. He claims he tasted the dregs and at once spat it out. He said it was as bitter as gall. Saying to her, "You must have taken pure salts. Did it fizz properly?" She answered, "It didn't fizz very much, and it seemed lumpy, and there was a sediment in the glass." Dorothy withdrew, taking Joan to see her father, while in the meantime Lockyer quickly washed and dressed and was down in the kitchen at 6:55 a.m. Dorothy was cutting up lunches while her baby sat nearby on the floor. Suddenly she said that she had lost the use of her legs. She attempted to walk, but swayed and dragged her legs as if paralysed. Lockyer helped her to a chair, and when she was settled, made an emetic for her of mustard and cold water. He connected her sudden debility to the bitter drink, he said. But the emetic did not cause Dorothy to vomit. Rather, she began moaning loudly enough for Reg Thorne to hear her from his bed, causing him to rush down to check on her. Lockyer mixed another mustard emetic, this time with warm water, but Dorothy had gone rigid and was unable to swallow the draught, and her hands were shaking. He heard Reg phoning the doctor, stating that something serious had happened. They then carried her to her room and laid her on the bed. Lockyer then phoned the doctor again to urge him to hurry. Still intent on making Dorothy vomit, Lockyer tried to put one of his fingers down her throat, but her teeth were clenched so tightly that he could not. When the doctor arrived, he instructed Lockyer to put the glass and powders in a safe place. According to Lockyer, Dorothy did not take the powders every day, and he only very occasionally. He told the newspaper that he and Reg had continued living together in the same house since the tragedy, and that generally they had got along well, except one night when Reg had not spoken to Lockyer at all. As he was going to bed, he asked Reg what was the matter. Reg replied, "Plenty." "Well, tell me what the trouble is," Lockyer replied. "Nothing that will bear talking about," Reg declared. The following day, Lockyer left early without seeing the other man. Lockyer later said that the police had phoned him and said that following the interrogations, they no longer believed that Lockyer was the poisoner. At the inquest on the 27th of July, the city coroner declared it to be the most mysterious case he had ever worked on. He said he excluded the husband and the boarder, adding that he had watched them carefully, and their whole attitude seemed to point to nothing else but innocence. Likewise, he excluded suicide, and admitted he could not fathom how the poison had gotten into Dorothy's drink. He then declared an open verdict. For the next 2 years, every Sunday Reg would visit his wife and son at the cemetery. The sorrow he felt eventually convinced him to depart from Australia, and he began disposing of assets. His father-in-law offered to make little Joan his heiress if she was allowed to remain behind with her grandparents, but Reg could not part from her. There was a large gathering of friends at Mossman to farewell Reg Thorne, where he was presented with an illuminated address signed by the mayor and others. The address ended, "Bon voyage, Reg. We hope we are saying au revoir and not goodbye, and you must not forget the meaning of boomerang, one of the gifts we are asking you to accept this night." Reg and his daughter left Australia on the ship Jervis Bay In December 1934, Cropley's secretary hurriedly presented a doll to Joan from her grandfather. A large crowd of friends saw the pair off, holding a party on board the ship before filing out onto the wharf. Reg had tears trickling down his cheeks as the vessel pulled away from the wharf. The ship arrived in Southampton, England on the 28th of January 1935. Dorothy's father passed away later in 1935. In England, Reg lived with his unmarried sister until his death at Brighton on the 24th of October 1945. Joan Thorne married Mark Daniel in 1951. Alfred George Lockyer eventually met a woman named Patricia Augusta O'Keeffe in 1939, and they remained on good terms for 2 years until June 1941. She then broke up with him and he fell into a depression. For 3 weeks he was drinking heavily. On the 28th of July 1941, he was found dead in his room at Alfred Street, North Sydney. 6 months earlier, he had told Patricia that he had a jar of poison and that he had attempted to kill himself but failed as he could not get the lid off the jar. This time he had gotten the jar open and taken the poison. It was not publicly revealed what type of poison he used. The mystery of who poisoned Dorothy Thorne, the question of whether she was the intended victim or not, and the motive for tainting the powder are all unanswered enigmas lost in the dark corners of history.